5:47 in the morning, August 8th, 1941. The sky over Odessa was the color of an old wound, dark purple bleeding into grey, the sun not yet risen, the world not yet fully awake. Somewhere across the rubble of what used to be a neighborhood, a dog was barking. Then it stopped. Nadia Kovačeva was 24 years old, and she had never killed anyone. She was lying flat against the cold ground behind a collapsed stone wall, her cheek pressed against the stock of her Mosin Nagant rifle, her breathing deliberately slow. In front of her, across 280 meters of open, broken ground, a German helmet was visible through a crack in the masonry of a destroyed farmhouse. The helmet wasn't moving, but the man wearing it was watching something. He was watching Sergeant Ostrov. Ostrov was 40 meters to Nadia's left, crouched behind a burned-out cart, completely unaware that a German rifle was trained on him. He was a big man, broad-shouldered, with hands that looked like they had been carved from oak. Yesterday, when Nadia hadn't eaten in 18 hours and was trying not to let anyone see how badly her hands were shaking, Ostrov had appeared beside her without a word and placed half a piece of bread in her palm. He didn't make a thing of it. He just walked away. Now he was about to die. Nadia's finger found the trigger. Her instructor's voice came back to her, a hard, weathered man named Barik, who had trained snipers for 11 years and had the eyes of someone who had seen everything twice. Don't think about killing, think about the problem. Distance, wind, target movement, it's mathematics, not murder. 280 meters, light crosswind from the west. Target stationary. She made the adjustment. She settled the crosshairs on the crack where the helmet showed. And for one fraction of 1 second, she understood that everything that came after this moment would be different from everything that came before it. She squeezed. The rifle kicked hard against her shoulder. The sound cracked across the rubble like a stone splitting. Through the scope, she watched the German helmet jerk sharply backward and disappear. Ostrov spun around, confused, scanning the ruins, not understanding what had just happened or why he was still alive. Nadia chambered another round, scanned. Nothing moved. She had just killed her first German soldier. She felt nothing, no guilt, no triumph, just one single cold, immediate question rising up through the silence. Where's the next one? Freeze on that moment. Because to understand what Nadia Kovačeva became, you have to understand what she was before it. And what she was, 11 days earlier, was a history student, not a soldier, not a warrior, a 24-year-old woman sitting in a university lecture hall, taking notes on the fall of the Roman Empire, completely ordinary, completely unknown, with 309 kills still ahead of her, and no idea that any of this was coming. Her name would one day be spoken in fear by an entire German army. But on July 22nd, 1941, she was just Nadia. She had been shooting since she was 14. That part is important, because people would later try to explain her away, reduce her to luck, or propaganda, or something easier to accept than the truth. So understand this clearly. Nadia Kovačeva was not a natural-born killer. She was a natural-born marksman. There is a difference, and it matters. Her father had been a factory supervisor who spent his weekends at a shooting range outside the city. He brought Nadia along because she asked to come, and she asked to come because she was the kind of person who was interested in everything. By 15, she was out scoring men twice her age. By 17, she had competed in regional competitions and placed in the top tier. She earned her marksman certificate the same week she enrolled in university to study history. She loved both things equally: the precision of a well-placed shot, the precision of a well-documented fact. To her, they were the same kind of intelligence. The ability to see clearly, measure carefully, and act without hesitation. Then the bombs came. July 22nd, 1941. 6:14 in the morning. The first German aircraft appeared over the city, like dark birds against the pale sky. By 6:20, the explosions had begun. By 6:45, 3 city blocks were burning, and the university was gone. Nadia was 2 streets away when it happened. 2. She heard the sound. A deep, structural collapse, the kind that you feel in your chest before you hear it with your ears. And she ran toward it without thinking. 73 students died in that building. Her professor, a quiet man named Dr. Antonov, who had spent 30 years reconstructing the economic systems of collapsed empires, was pulled from the rubble after 2 hours. He died before the ambulance arrived. Her closest friend, a girl named Vera, had been in the library on the 3rd floor. The library was the first section to catch fire. The stairwell collapsed in the first 60 seconds. Vera didn't get out. Nadia stood in the street outside the burning building for a long time. She didn't cry. She wasn't built that way. She stood there and watched. And something inside her became very still and very cold and very clear. The next morning she walked to the recruiting office. The man behind the desk was a lieutenant named Perov. He was perhaps 45, with a thick moustache and the particular expression of a man who has already decided what he's going to say before you open your mouth. He looked at Nadia. He looked at the form she had filled out, requesting assignment to a combat infantry unit. He set the form down. Then he said, and he didn't say it cruelly, which somehow made it worse, "We need nurses, medical units, that's where women belong right now." Nadia told him she had been shooting since she was 14. She told him about the marksman certificate, the regional competitions, the range scores. She laid it out the way she would lay out an academic argument, clearly, with evidence, without emotion. Perov listened, then he smiled slightly, the way men smile when they're about to explain something they believe you're too simple to already know. "Shooting targets," he said, "is not combat. Combat is blood. It's noise. It's men dying next to you. Women can't handle it." Nadia looked at him for a moment. "Test me," she said. Perov took her outside to a practice range behind the building. He handed her a rifle, a standard-issue Mosin Nagant, not her own, unfamiliar weight and balance, and pointed to a wooden fence post 100 meters away. She fired 5 rounds. All 5 went through the center. Not near the center, through it, a tight cluster you could cover with your palm. Perov stared at the post for a long moment. Then he picked up Nadia's form from where he'd set it down, and he signed it. He didn't say anything else, he didn't apologize, he just signed it and handed it back. She was assigned to the 25th Rifle Division as a sniper. That was 4 months before she took her first shot. 4 months of training, marching, digging, waiting. 4 months of learning how to sleep on cold ground and how to stay still for hours, and how to breathe when everything around you was trying to make you stop. And then Odessa. The city of Odessa sits on the Black Sea coast like a man with his back against a wall. By the time Nadia arrived in August 1941, that metaphor was almost literally true. The Wehrmacht had committed 3 full divisions to taking the city, 150,000 German and Romanian soldiers advancing on Soviet positions. The defenders were outnumbered 3-1, short on ammunition, short on food, and losing ground by the day. The city refused to fall. That part matters too, because Odessa was not defended by heroes. It was defended by people who had nowhere else to go, which is a different thing entirely, and in some ways more powerful. Nadia was assigned to a unit operating on the northern perimeter. She had been given her rifle, 40 rounds of ammunition, and a position on the line. Her first night, she lay in a trench and listened to the artillery in the distance and tried to remember what silence sounded like. She had been awake for 31 hours by the time the morning of August 8th arrived. No sleep, no food since a cup of thin broth the afternoon before. Just her rifle, the cold ground, and the objective: hold the line. The German sniper had been working the northern perimeter for 3 days before Nadia identified him. She had noticed the pattern the way she noticed historical patterns, by looking for what was consistent, what repeated, what revealed intent beneath the apparent randomness. He fired in the early morning. He targeted movement, not position. He was patient. He never fired twice from the same location in the same session. Professional, experienced, dangerous. On the morning of August 8th, Nadia had been in position since before dawn, watching the farmhouse ruins across no man's land. She had seen the German sniper settle into position at first light, just a helmet visible through a crack in the masonry, barely enough to confirm he was there. Then she saw where he was aiming. Ostrov. The big sergeant was crouched behind a burned-out cart, completely exposed to that angle, completely unaware. He had no idea that 280 meters away, a man was aligning crosshairs on the back of his skull. Nadia had maybe 15 seconds. She ran through the calculation in one long automatic breath. Distance, wind, angle, target stationary. The German's helmet was barely visible, just a sliver of steel through a 6-inch gap in broken masonry. A difficult shot, not impossible. Her hands were steady. That surprised her later when she thought about it. She had expected them to shake. They didn't. She made the adjustment for wind. She found the crosshairs. She let half a breath out and held the rest, and she squeezed. The crack of the shot rolled across the rubble and faded. Through her scope, the German helmet jerked backward, disappeared. Ostrov flinched, spun around, scanning. He looked directly toward where Nadia was lying and saw nothing. To him, the shot had come from nowhere. He didn't understand that he was alive because a 24-year-old history student had been paying attention. Nadia chambered another round, scanned the German lines for 60 seconds. Nothing moved. She had done it. Her first kill. August 8th, 1941. 5:47 in the morning. She lay there in the rubble and waited for something to happen inside her. For guilt or relief, or the weight of it to land on her chest the way people said it would. She had taken a human life. That was supposed to mean something enormous. What she felt was simpler than that. She felt the cold ground against her ribs. She felt the crosswind picking up slightly from the west. She felt her eyes moving along the German lines, searching. Where's the next one? That was it. That was all. She told herself it was mathematics, that the line between calculation and conscience was clean and permanent, and she had simply chosen which side to stand on. She believed it, or believed she believed it. And for a while, that was enough. In the weeks that followed her first kill, Nadia was in her position before sunrise every morning. She stayed until the light became too bright and the angle shifted. She moved carefully, methodically, never staying too long in one place, always watching the German lines the way a chess player watches the board. Not just the piece in front of you, but every piece and every piece they might become. By the end of August, her kill count had climbed steadily. The unit began to notice. Ostrov, who had never acknowledged that she'd saved his life, because that was not the kind of man he was, began leaving small things near her position. Extra rounds, a piece of hard cheese, once a folded piece of paper with nothing written on it, which she kept anyway. Officers started looking at her differently, not with respect exactly, with calculation. The kind of look that meant they were starting to think about how to use what she was. But Nadia was watching something else entirely. She was watching her fellow snipers die. One by one, week by week, the experienced shooters around her were being taken out, not by bad luck, not by poor marksmanship, by something more systematic than that, something that made the cold clarity inside her go colder still. They were dying because they were predictable, and she was beginning to understand what that meant, because the Germans weren't just defending anymore, they were hunting, and the hunters knew exactly where to look, and exactly when and exactly how Soviet doctrine said a sniper was supposed to move. The rulebook that was supposed to keep them alive was putting them in the ground. Nadia saw it clearly. She saw it the way she had always seen things, not through fear, not through doctrine, but through the cold and steady lens of a person who had been measuring distances and calculating angles since she was 14 years old. The book was wrong, and the people around her were going to keep dying until someone was willing to throw it away. Next, the first of them fell.
He had done everything right. It didn't matter. Her name was Morozova, Irina Morozova, 29 years old, 8 months on the front line, 47 confirmed kills. She was the best sniper in the unit before Nadia arrived, and she carried that fact the way experienced soldiers carry most things, quietly, without display, as simple information rather than pride. She had dark eyes that moved constantly, the habit of someone who had learned to treat stillness as a temporary condition.
She didn't talk much. When she did, it was worth listening to. Nadia had known her for 3 weeks, long enough to respect her, long enough to learn from watching how she moved, how she chose her positions, how she read the terrain, the way a sailor reads water. On the morning of August 19th, 1941, Irina Morozova positioned herself on the 3rd floor of a bombed-out apartment building on the eastern edge of the perimeter. 2 exit routes planned, sight lines covering 300 meters of open ground, textbook positioning, everything by the book. She engaged a German machine gun crew at 320 meters, 1 shot, clean kill. She moved immediately to her secondary position on the 2nd floor, waited 20 minutes exactly as doctrine required, engaged a German officer at 280 meters, another clean kill. She began moving to her tertiary position on the ground floor. A single shot came through the stairwell window. It hit her in the chest. She was dead before the medics reached the building. Nadia was 1 floor below when it happened. She heard the shot. Then she heard the sound of a body falling, the particular sound, heavy and sudden and final, that she would never in her life forget. Then silence. Then floating across no man's land from the German lines, something that turned her blood cold. Laughter. They knew. The Germans knew they had killed a Soviet sniper. They had been waiting for it. They had planned for it. Nadia pressed herself against the wall and did not move for 11 minutes. The German who killed Morozova was later identified through intercepted communications as Gerhard Steinhoff, Wehrmacht counter-sniper specialist, 89 confirmed kills, the majority of them Soviet snipers. He didn't hunt infantry, he hunted hunters. He had positioned himself that morning not to engage Soviet soldiers, but specifically to wait for a Soviet sniper to engage first, because he knew exactly what would happen after that shot. He knew where she would move, he knew the doctrine, he knew the timing, he knew the angles. Morozova had followed every rule perfectly. Steinhoff had counted on it. 6 days later, Corporal Viktor Stepanov died in a drainage ditch 400 meters from German lines. He was 19 years old. 6 weeks as a sniper. 11 confirmed kills. He was the kind of young man who asked good questions and laughed too loudly and made the people around him feel slightly more human than they had the day before. His positioning that morning was excellent. His concealment was perfect. He engaged a German patrol at dawn. 2 shots, 2 kills. The Germans scattered. Stepanov followed doctrine, stayed low, waited 15 minutes, prepared to move to his secondary position. A German artillery shell landed directly in the ditch. Nothing left to bury. The Germans had triangulated the approximate position from the angle of the shots, estimated his likely hide, and saturated the area. Standard counter-sniper protocol. Observe the shot, calculate the origin point, destroy the origin point. They hadn't seen Stepanov. They hadn't needed to. They had simply known where a Soviet sniper following Soviet doctrine would be hiding, and they had acted on that knowledge. Perfect concealment. perfect shot placement, perfect adherence to the rules. It didn't matter. By the first week of September, Nadia had watched 7 snipers die. 7. In less than 4 weeks. She had begun keeping a mental record, not of kills, but of patterns. Each death laid out in sequence, each engagement broken down into its component parts. She had the instincts of a historian, the belief that events do not happen randomly, that beneath apparent chaos there is always a structure, always a logic, always a cause that precedes the effect. The cause in this case was not German superiority, it was Soviet predictability. She sat with that understanding for 2 days, working through its implications the way she would work through a difficult historical argument, testing it against the evidence, looking for the exception that would disprove it, finding none. Soviet sniper doctrine was clear and consistent. Find concealment. Engage from a stable position. Move immediately after firing. Never fire more than 3 shots from the same location. Never remain in position longer than 30 minutes. Always have 2 exit routes planned. These were not bad rules. They had been written by experienced men who understood the fundamentals of survival on a battlefield. The doctrine made sense, it had logic behind it. But it had one catastrophic flaw. It was the same for every Soviet sniper, every time, in every engagement. And the Germans knew it by heart. When a Soviet sniper fired, the Germans didn't need to see her. They only needed to understand the doctrine, calculate the angles, and wait for her to do exactly what the doctrine said she would do, because she always did, because everyone did. The Germans had turned Soviet discipline into a targeting system, and it was working. Nadia made her decision on September 2nd, 1941, lying awake in the dark, staring at the underside of a collapsed ceiling beam, listening to artillery in the distance. She was going to break the rules, not bend them, break them completely. She was going to expose herself deliberately, make herself a target, draw fire, and then kill whoever shot at her. It was, by any rational measure, insane. Soviet command would court-martial her if they found out. Alexei Baturin, her unit's senior sniper coordinator, a lean, careful man of 40, who spoke in short sentences and had a gift for understatement, had told her exactly 3 weeks earlier that deliberate position exposure was the fastest way to stop being a problem for anyone. He meant it as a warning. She filed it under a different category. She thought about Morozova, who had done everything right and died anyway. She thought about Stepanov, who was 19 years old and had perfect concealment and didn't exist anymore. She thought about the 5 others between them. Then she thought about Steinhoff, out there somewhere in the German lines, counting on the next Soviet sniper to follow the same rules as the last one. She wasn't going to be the next Soviet sniper. The technique she designed was built around a single insight. The Germans were reactive hunters. They waited for a Soviet sniper to reveal a position, then move to intercept. If she could create a false position, make them react to something that wasn't real, she could use their reaction to locate them, and once she located them, she would have a window. 2 to 4 seconds before they understood what had happened. 2 to 4 seconds was enough. She would set up 2 nests, primary and secondary, but only 4 to 6 meters apart. Close enough to move between them in under 3 seconds. In the primary nest, she would place a decoy, a helmet propped on a stick, a spare sleeve stuffed tightly with straw shaped, roughly like a shoulder, anything that read as human from 300 meters through a rifle scope. She would hide in the secondary nest, completely still, rifle aimed at the area where a German counter-sniper would most likely position himself based on sight lines, sun angle, and available cover. When the German shot at the decoy, his muzzle flash would give away his position. She would have 1 shot. If she missed, he would know her real position, and she would be dead. If she hit, she would move immediately, reset the trap, and do it again. She tested it for the first time on September the 3rd, 1941. Early morning, German lines approximately 340 meters away. She chose a ruined cellar, low to the ground, where Germans rarely expected Soviet snipers to be because Soviet doctrine favored elevated positions. That asymmetry was the point. She set up the helmet decoy in the primary position, propped on broken masonry at just the right angle to look from a distance like a sniper settling in. Then she moved 4 meters to the right into the secondary position, pressed herself into the rubble, and waited. Her muscles began to ache after 20 minutes, her eyes watered from the effort of staying focused without blinking too often. She didn't move. At 6:17 in the morning, a shot cracked across no man's land. The helmet jerked and fell. Nadia was already scanning. There, 320 meters out behind a low brick wall, a shape, a figure, the ghost of movement where movement shouldn't be. She had 3 seconds at most before he understood he'd hit a decoy. She found the shape in her crosshairs. She fired. The figure dropped. She was already moving before she confirmed it, abandoning both positions, moving 40 meters west at a low crawl to a different building. From her new position, she found the German lines through her scope and waited. 2 soldiers appeared, moving carefully through the rubble. They were dragging something, a body. It had worked. Over the following 6 weeks, Nadia refined the method with the same methodical patience she had once applied to historical research. She studied the Germans the way she had once studied collapsed civilizations, looking for the patterns beneath the surface, the repeating behaviors that revealed how they thought. They preferred elevated positions, second or third floors of damaged buildings where they had sight lines and felt secure. They avoided ground-level hides because Soviet artillery targeted those first. They positioned themselves with the sun at their backs when possible. They almost never moved during daylight once they were set. She used all of it. She placed her decoys at angles visible from elevated positions. She timed operations for when the sun would be in their eyes rather than hers. She built her secondary nests at ground level, in positions Germans would dismiss as too obvious, too contrary to standard practice. By October, she had 78 confirmed kills. 22 of them were German snipers. Word moved through Soviet units the way important information always moves in wartime, quietly, person to person, in the spaces between official reports. There was a woman sniper on the northern perimeter who hunted the hunters. Officers who had lost men to German snipers began to seek her out. Some brought extra rations, some brought vodka, some brought only their grief, which was the heaviest thing of all. A lieutenant named Marchuk came to her on October 12th. He was perhaps 35, with a face that had aged 10 years in the past 2 months. His platoon had lost 9 men in 4 days to a single German sniper operating near a railway junction half a kilometer from the front. The sniper was mobile, never firing from the same position twice. He targeted officers and sergeants, the men whose loss would cause the most disruption. He was systematic, intelligent, and invisible. Marchuk's remaining men had stopped moving during daylight, an entire combat platoon paralyzed. He asked Nadia if she would find the German and kill him. She said yes, not for the vodka. She said yes because she thought about Morozova's body in a stairwell and Stepanov reduced to nothing in a ditch, and because this was the only language that could answer what had been done to them. She spent 2 full days studying the railway junction before she set up. The German was disciplined. He never repeated a position. But discipline has its own pattern and pattern has its own logic, and Nadia had become very good at finding logic in places where other people saw only chaos. She identified 11 possible firing positions within the area, too many to cover directly. She needed to force his hand. She constructed a decoy that read from a distance as a Soviet officer. She placed it where it would be visible from 8 of the 11 possible locations. Then she settled into her hide 12 meters away and waited. At 6:30 in the morning, the decoy stood in position. 40 minutes passed. Nothing. She stayed motionless. Her back ached in ways she had stopped trying to describe. Her legs had gone past pain into something that felt like absence. At 7:11, the shot came. The decoy's helmet spun away. The muzzle flash appeared 420 meters out, inside a destroyed railway boxcar, a position she had dismissed during her survey as too exposed, too obvious. A brilliant choice precisely because it looked wrong. She had underestimated him. She adjusted for 420 meters and crosswind, running the calculation in the 2 seconds she had while the German was still processing what he'd hit. She fired. Through the scope, she saw him jerk backward, not fall. Jerk. He was hit, but not fatally. He was wounded, moving, trying to get low inside the boxcar. She chambered another round, fired again. He dropped. Marchuk's men found the German an hour later, 2 shots, one through the shoulder, one through the head. His logbook listed 67 confirmed kills. Marchuk stood over the body for a long moment, then looked at Nadia. He said it wasn't mathematics. He said it was either courage or insanity, and he couldn't tell which. Nadia told him it was both, and that the difference didn't matter if it worked. By the end of October, the German bounty on her had climbed to 1,000 Reichsmarks. Their propaganda broadcasts mentioned her by name, or rather, by the name they had invented for her. The Devil Woman. Some broadcasts claim she was a myth, a story fabricated for morale. Some claim she was a man, some claim the numbers were invented. Nadia heard the broadcasts and found them useful, not because they flattered her, because they confirmed something important. The Germans were afraid, and afraid men make mistakes. Afraid men hesitate at the wrong moment, second-guess the shot that needed to be instinct. She began leaving small markers near her positions. A playing card, the Queen of Spades, placed deliberately where Germans would find it. It cost her nothing. It cost them sleep. Fear, she had learned, was a force multiplier. She didn't need to create it. She only needed to manage it, to ensure that the psychological weight of her presence preceded her into every engagement. She had 78 confirmed kills and was 24 years old. And somewhere across German lines, Gerhard Steinhoff, 89 kills, the man who had killed Morozova, was still alive. She thought about him every morning before sunrise. She thought about him the way you think about a problem that hasn't been solved yet. The price on her head kept climbing, the kill count kept climbing with it. Then winter came, and with it, Sevastopol. And before she could get to Steinhoff, the war got to him first, and then they sent someone far worse. Gerhard Steinhoff was killed on October 31st, 1941. Not by Nadia. A Soviet artillery strike hit a building he had used as a firing position 3 times in 2 weeks, a mistake that surprised her because she had credited him with more discipline than that. Perhaps the pressure of her growing kill count had changed something in how he operated. Perhaps he had simply run out of luck. On a long enough timeline, even the best of them did. Baturin delivered the information without ceremony, the way he delivered everything. Nadia sat with it for a moment. She had expected to feel something clean when it happened, resolution, or at minimum, the quiet satisfaction of an account settled. What she felt instead was a flat, strange deflation. She had been preparing for him for weeks. She had been sharpening herself against the idea of him, building the engagement in her mind, refining it. And now that problem was gone, solved by artillery, solved by accident, solved by someone who didn't even know what they had done. There would always be another one. There always was. His name was Erwin Volkart. The city of Sevastopol had been under siege since the end of October. It sits on a peninsula jutting into the Black Sea, surrounded on 3 sides by water, and on the 4th by the full weight of a German army that had decided the city needed to fall before winter made the campaign impossible. The defenders had no clean supply lines, no reinforcements coming. and ammunition enough for perhaps 3 more weeks of sustained engagement. They held anyway, not because they had a plan, because they had no alternative. By the first week of November, the front had contracted to the point where Soviet defensive positions were sometimes within 200 meters of German lines. Snipers on both sides operated in close, dangerous proximity. The urban ruin of the outer districts had become a maze of kill zones, and moving through it in daylight was something you did once or didn't do again. It was into this that Erwin Volkart arrived. He announced himself the way skilled hunters announce themselves, through absence rather than presence. The first death was a captain named Sorokin, November 4th. Single shot, early morning, fatal. By the time anyone understood what had happened, the position from which the shot had come was empty and cold. The second was a senior lieutenant, November 5th. Same pattern, single shot, different location, no trace. The 3rd through 11th followed over the next 2 days. Every victim was an officer or senior sergeant. Every shot was fatal. No second shots, no wasted rounds, no hesitation. Volkart was not testing positions or feeling out the terrain. He knew exactly what he was doing and exactly where he was doing it from, and by the time Soviet soldiers turned to look, he was already somewhere else. 11 dead in 3 days. An entire sector of the defense was coming apart at the seams. Major Chernov called Nadia to the command post on the evening of November the 7th. He was a compact, serious man who had the quality, rare in wartime, of saying exactly what he meant without decoration. He spread photographs of the 11 dead across the table. Each one had been shot once. Each shot had been perfect. He told her the sector was close to collapse. Junior officers were refusing assignments in the affected area. Soldiers who had held their positions through 2 months of siege were beginning to ask questions that didn't have good answers. He told her she had 48 hours. Nadia looked at the photographs for a long time. She looked at the entry points of the wounds, the angles, the locations where each body had fallen. She laid them out in sequence, looking for the structure beneath the apparent randomness. The shots all fell within a 400-meter radius. All in the early morning, between first light and full sunrise, all targeting command-level personnel, which meant Volkart wasn't hunting targets of opportunity. He was hunting specifically, selectively, with a strategic objective. He wasn't just killing people, he was dismantling a command structure. That required intelligence, observation, a patience that went beyond what most snipers were willing to sustain. She was dealing with someone who thought the way she thought. That was the most dangerous thing she had encountered so far. She spent the first day with Baturin, walking the perimeter after dark. He was not a man who frightened easily. He had been on the front since the first week of the invasion and had the calm of someone who had made peace with the full range of possible outcomes. But as they moved through the ruins that night, reading the terrain by moonlight, he said quietly that he didn't like this one. That 94 kills meant 94 engagements, which meant Volkart had never made a mistake significant enough to cost him his life. That was not luck. That was mastery. Nadia told him what she was planning to do. Baturin was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "You'll be standing in the open." She said yes. He said, "If you've guessed wrong about his position." She said she knew. He didn't argue further. He was not the kind of man who argued with conclusions already reached. He only said, before they parted, that she should make sure her rifle was perfectly clean, that at the distance and angle she was describing, any mechanical variance would matter. She cleaned the rifle twice that night. She identified 3 possible positions from her analysis of the kill angles and the terrain. A church tower at the northern edge of the sector, a collapsed apartment building to the east, and a school rooftop that provided coverage across the command post area. The church tower was most likely. Highest elevation, clearest sight lines, a concealed approach route that a careful man could use without being observed. But Volkart had 94 kills. He hadn't survived 94 engagements by choosing the obvious position. She couldn't be certain, which meant she couldn't set a standard decoy and wait. He was too experienced for that. He might recognize the setup and use it to locate her secondary position instead. She needed to be the decoy herself, a real target, something worth breaking discipline for. November 8th, 5:42 in the morning, the sky was the particular darkness that comes just before first light. Not night anymore, not yet dawn, a threshold color that doesn't have a proper name. Nadia put on an officer's coat. The rank insignia was visible at the collar. From a distance, through a rifle scope in low light, she would read as a Soviet officer standing near the command post. Exactly the kind of target Volkart had been selecting for 4 days. Her Mosin Nagant was 4 meters away, propped against a broken wall aimed at the church tower. She stood up. In the open, alone. The cold was immediate and total, the kind that doesn't just sit on your skin but moves through it, into the bones, into the quiet place behind your sternum, where fear lives. She stood straight, didn't crouch, didn't look toward the German lines. An officer at dawn reviewing something, completely ordinary. Every nerve in her body was telling her to move, to get low, to put stone between herself and whatever was out there in the darkness. She didn't move. 1 minute passed. 2. She thought about Morozova, the sound of a body falling through a stairwell, the laughter that came after. She thought about Stepanov. 19 years old, nothing left to bury. She used those thoughts the way you use pain sometimes. Not to suffer it, but to focus through it. To convert it into stillness. 5 minutes. 10. The sky was beginning to lighten at the eastern edge. In another few minutes the sun would be fully up and the moment would pass. Either Volkart wasn't in the church tower, or he was watching her and waiting for something more certain. 12 minutes. 15. At 5:59 in the morning, the shot came. She heard it before she felt it. The crack of a Mauser K98, a sound she had learned to identify precisely because identifying it quickly was the difference between reacting and not reacting. The bullet passed so close to her head that she felt the displacement of air against her left temple, a sensation like a finger drawn quickly across the skin. She was already moving, left, down, toward the rifle. Her hands found the stock before she was fully prone. She brought the scope up toward the church tower, 300 meters out, the stone structure dark against the lightening sky. There. A figure. Moving back into the shadows of the tower window. He had fired and was pulling back, because that was what a disciplined sniper did. He didn't wait to confirm the kill if there was any chance of return fire. He was fast. She didn't have time for a measured shot, no time to run the full calculation, no time to settle the crosshairs and breathe and squeeze with the careful deliberation she had spent months developing. She pointed. She fired. One shot. By instinct. By the accumulated weight of 10 years of practice that had moved the mathematics out of her conscious mind and into something faster and deeper. Through the scope, the figure in the tower window staggered, stepped backward, disappeared into the darkness of the interior. Nadia stayed flat and did not move. The sun continued to rise. No second shot came from the church tower, no sound at all. 10 minutes, then 15, then Baturin's voice, low and controlled, "Clearing team is moving." At the 20-minute mark, she saw him appear in the narrow window of the church tower, 3 stories up. He looked down at her position. He raised one hand, all clear, target down. They found Volkart in the upper chamber of the tower, on his back, a single bullet wound through the center of his chest. His Mauser K98 still in his hands. His personal Zeiss scope The kind a man acquired and kept because he had learned to trust it above all others, was cracked from the impact of the fall. His logbook was in the breast pocket of his coat, 94 entries, each one dated, each one precise. Positions, distances, wind conditions, time of shot. The last entry was dated November 7th. He had written nothing for November 8th. He never had the chance. Baturin handed Nadia the logbook without comment. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of 94 decisions that had each lasted a second or less and had each ended a life. Then she gave it back. She sat down on a piece of broken masonry. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the adrenaline crash that follows the moment of absolute extremity when the body finally processes what the mind held at bay. She waited for it to pass. It took a while. Between August 8, 1941 and June of 1942, Nadia Korvacheva killed 309 German soldiers. 36 of them were snipers, 187 were officers. Every kill confirmed through standard verification protocol, independent witness or physical evidence, no exceptions. She was not a myth, not a propaganda construct, not a number built to serve a narrative. She was a 25-year-old woman with a Mosin Nagant rifle and a set of techniques she had developed by watching her friends die and refusing to let their deaths be meaningless. She used the bait method in more than 60 documented engagements. She was wounded 4 separate times: shrapnel in September 1941, a concussion in December, shrapnel to the leg in February 1942, and finally, in June of 1942, a mortar round that sent fragments into her face, fracturing her jaw, damaging her left eye, leaving scars that never fully faded. Soviet command pulled her from the front in July 1942. She was 25 years old. She had never lost her nerve. Here is what she never said publicly, but what was true. Somewhere around the 100th kill, she couldn't say exactly when, the faces started staying. She had told herself in the beginning that she felt nothing, that it was a problem to be solved and not a person to be mourned, and that the line between those two things was clean and permanent. She had believed it, or believed she believed it, which in those first months was enough to keep her functional and alive. But the mind is not a rifle. It cannot be aimed indefinitely at a single point without eventually turning itself inward. The faces accumulated the way debts accumulate, quietly, invisibly, until the weight of them becomes impossible to ignore. Every face through the scope stayed, all 309 of them. She carried that through 30 years of peacetime, through university lectures and faculty meetings, and long winters in a city slowly rebuilding itself. The mathematics had been real. The distances, the wind, the adjustments, the 2 to 4 second windows that were everything. But the faces were real too, and they did not observe the boundary she had drawn between calculation and conscience. That was the price. Not the wounds, not the jaw that ached in cold weather, or the eye that never fully recovered. The price was the arithmetic that never stopped. In August 1942, she stood in a formal hall in Moscow and received the Hero of the Soviet Union medal. She was photographed in her uniform, the scars visible at her jawline, her expression carrying the quality of someone who finds ceremony slightly absurd but understands its function. She was sent on a goodwill tour, Britain first, then the United States. The purpose was straightforward. Here was proof that the Soviet people were fighting and dying and winning, and the Western Allies should open a second front before there was nothing left worth winning. In Britain she met Winston Churchill. He studied her the way powerful men study things that confuse them. Then he asked, in the direct way that was his habit, how it felt to kill 309 people. She said she didn't think about killing. She thought about problems, distance, wind, the seconds available. He said that sounded like a way of not answering. She said it was the only answer she had, that the honest version was longer than the question deserved, and that she was very tired. Churchill didn't press further. He was a man who had sent thousands of people to their deaths from the comfort of a situation room, and perhaps he understood that she was not going to give him the dramatic answer he was looking for, the heroic narrative, the passionate declaration. She was just tired. In October 1942, she arrived in the United States. American newspapers called her the most dangerous woman in the world. They photographed her at every stop and wrote about her in the superlative terms that American journalism favored. Some military officials were skeptical of her record. The numbers seemed impossible. The story seemed too clean. The US War Department investigated. And they confirmed what the Soviet records showed. 309 kills, verified, documented, real. Eleanor Roosevelt met her in Washington and did something unexpected. She treated her like a person, not a curiosity, not a symbol, a person. The First Lady was genuinely interested, not in the kill count, but in the woman who had accumulated it and what that accumulation had cost. They traveled together for weeks, and in the spaces between the official appearances they talked in the way that becomes possible when the performance is temporarily suspended. Nadia told Eleanor that she hadn't wanted any of this, that she had wanted to finish her degree and write her dissertation on the economic collapse of late imperial Russia, that the war had made those plans seem very distant, belonging to a version of herself she was no longer entirely certain she recognized. Eleanor listened without filling the silence with easy comfort. She offered attention instead, which was rarer and better. Nadia carried that conversation with her as one of the few clean memories from those months, a moment of being seen as a complete human being rather than a figure, a number, a story. She returned to the Soviet Union in March 1943 and was assigned to training duty. For months, then years, she stood in front of rooms full of young snipers and passed on everything she had built in the rubble of Odessa and the ruins of Sevastopol. The decoy techniques, the counter-positioning methods, the psychological approach, treating every engagement as a chess problem rather than a survival crisis, because survival crises made you reactive and chess problems made you deliberate. By 1944, Soviet sniper doctrine had been formally rewritten to incorporate her methods. The defensive posture that had killed Morozova and Stepanov and 5 others was replaced with aggressive counter-sniper tactics built on the principles she had developed by breaking every rule in the book. It saved lives, thousands of them, across the remaining years of the war. Her name was not on the rewritten doctrine. One of her students became famous. His photograph appeared in newspapers across the Soviet Union. His name was spoken with the same reverence hers had once been, in the brief season when newspapers wrote about her. He was celebrated as a master of the craft, an icon, a hero of the people. He was good, genuinely good. She had taught him everything. Nadia read the newspaper article about him in a faculty office between 2 lectures on the fall of the Roman Empire. She set the paper down on the desk. She looked out the window at a city still rebuilding itself from the inside out, at streets that had been rubble and were now ordinary, at buildings that had been ruins and were now filled with the ordinary sounds of peacetime. She thought, so this is how it ends? Not with a bullet, with a footnote. She sat with that for exactly as long as it deserved. Then she picked up her lecture notes and went back to work. She finished her degree, she wrote the dissertation. She taught history for many years at a university in the same city where a bomb had killed her professor and her closest friend and set everything else in motion, where Vera had died in a library fire, where Dr. Antonov had been pulled from rubble and had not survived, where a 24-year-old student had decided one morning that she had run out of alternative options. She did not speak publicly about the war with any frequency. When she did, she was precise and unemotional. Dates, locations, confirmed numbers. The framework she had built to survive it, maintained now simply because it was what remained. She died on October 10th, 1974. She was 58 years old. She had outlived Morozova by 33 years. She had outlived Stepanov by 33 years. She had outlived the 7 who came before she understood what was happening, whose deaths had been her real education. There is a photograph of her at a military museum. She is 24 years old in the picture, taken before the mortar round, before the scars, before Sevastopol. Her rifle is in her hands. She is looking at something outside the frame. Some point in the distance, some target or calculation or problem not yet solved. She does not look like a hero. She does not look like a symbol or an icon or the most dangerous woman in the world. She looks like someone who has already decided what she's going to do and is simply waiting for the moment to arrive. That look is the whole story. She stood in the open when hiding was losing. She aimed by instinct when instinct was all she had. She broke every rule in the book because the book was getting people killed, and she decided that was no longer acceptable, and she acted on that decision with a precision and a nerve that no one, not the recruiting officer who told her to become a nurse, not the German army that put a bounty on her name, not the historians who would later struggle to explain her, had been prepared for. She never asked to be remembered. She went home after the war and taught history and carried 309 faces through 30 years of ordinary life and died in the same city where it had all begun. And that, more than any of the numbers, more than any of the confirmed kills, or the bounties, or the medals, or the headlines, is what she left behind. The proof that one person, deciding clearly and acting without hesitation, can change the mathematics of an entire war. She didn't fight to be remembered. She fought because the alternative was to be forgotten while still alive, and that is why, 30 years after her death, 50 years longer, we cannot forget her.